kept open for negotiation. Wavell's mistake. Wavell announced a breakdown of talks, thus giving the League a virtual veto. Vi. The Indian National Army and Subhash Bose. Subhash Chandra Bose was an intrepid man. He passed the Indian Civil Services examination, securing 4th position, but resigned from the service in 1921 to join the struggle for freedom. His political guru was Chittaranjan Das. He became mayor of Calcutta in 1923. In March 1940, Bose convened an anti-compromise conference at Ramgarh. It was a joint effort of the Forward Bloc and the Kisan Sabha. Bose came to be called Netaji by the people of Germany. He gave the famous slogan, Jai Hind, from the Free India Center, Germany. He began regular broadcasts from Berlin Radio in January 1942, which enthused Indians. Origin and first phase of the Indian National Army, INA. 1. Idea of creating an army out of the Indian prisoners of war, POWs, was originally that of Mohan Singh. The Japanese handed over the Indian prisoners of war to Mohan Singh, who tried to recruit them into an Indian National Army. 2. INA got a boost with the outbreak of the Quit India movement in India. In September 1942, the first division of the INA was formed with 16,300 men. 3. The second phase began with the arrival of Subhash Bose in Singapore. But before that, in June 1943, Subhash Chandra Bose, under pseudo-name Abid Hussain, reached Tokyo, met the Japanese Prime Minister, Tojo. 4. In Japan, Rashbehari Bose eventually became a naturalized citizen. He founded the Indian Club of Tokyo, and gave lectures on the evils of Western imperialism. 5. Subhash Bose became Supreme Commander of the INA on August 25. On October 21, 1943, Subhash Bose formed the Provisional Government for Free India at Singapore with H.C. Chatterjee, Finance Portfolio, M.A. Iyer, Broadcasting, Lakshmi Swaminathan, Women Department, etc. The famous slogan, "Give me blood, I will give you freedom," was given in Malaya. The INA headquarters was shifted to Rangoon, in Burma, in January 1944, and the army recruits were to march from there with the war cry, "Chalo Delhi," on their lips. 6. On November 6, 1943, Andaman and Nicobar Islands was given by the Japanese army to the INA. The islands were renamed as Shahid Dweep and Swaraj Dweep respectively. On July 6, 1944, Subhash Bose addressed Mahatma Gandhi as Father of Nation, from the Azad Hind Radio, the first person to call Gandhi Father of Nation. 7. Azad Hind Force crossed the Burma border, and stood on Indian soil on March 18, 1944. The INA units subsequently advanced up to Kohima and Impel. On April 14, Colonel Malik of the Bahadur Group hoisted the INA flag for the first time on the Indian mainland at Moirang, in Manipur, where the INA Memorial Complex stands today, to enthusiastic cries of "Jai Hind" and "Netaji Zindabad." On August 15, 1945, the surrender of Japan in the Second World War took place, and with this the INA also surrendered. 8. On August 18, 1945, reportedly, Subhash Bose died mysteriously in an air crash at Taipei, Taiwan. www.desireyes.com Mail id, caredesireyes@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 113. Space for your notes. Chapter 24 Postwar National Scenario Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains, www.desireyes.com. 2 strands of national upsurge. 2 basic strands of national upsurge can be identified during the last 2 years of British rule. A. Tortuous negotiations involving the government, Congress and Muslim League, increasingly accompanied by communal violence and culminating in freedom and the partition. B. Sporadic, localized and often extremely militant and united mass action by workers, peasants and statespeoples which took the form of a countrywide strike wave. This kind of activity was occasioned by the INA release movement, Royal Indian Navy, RIN, revolt, Tebaga movement, Worli revolt, Punjab Kisan Morchas, Travancore People's Struggle, especially the Punapura Vyala episode, and the Telangana Peasant Revolt. Wavell plan backed by the Conservative government in Britain failed to break the constitutional deadlock. In July 1945, Labour Party formed the government in Britain. In August 1945, elections to central and provincial assemblies were announced. In September 1945, it was announced that a constituent assembly would be convened after the elections via change in government's attitude. End of the war resulted in a change in balance of global power. The UK was no more a big power while the USA and USSR emerged as superpowers, both of which favoured freedom for India. The new Labour government was more sympathetic to Indian demands. Throughout Europe, there was a wave of socialist radical governments. British soldiers were weary and tired and the British economy lay shattered. There was an anti-imperialist wave in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and Indonesia, resisting efforts to replant French and Dutch rule there. Officials feared another Congress revolt, a revival of the 1942 situation but much more dangerous because of a likely combination of attacks on communications, agrarian revolts, labor trouble, army disaffection joined by government officials and the police in the presence of INA men with some military experience. Elections were inevitable once the war ended since the last elections had been held in 1934 for the centre and in 1937 for the provinces. 2. Congress election campaign and INA trials. www.desirous.com Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com Spectrum short notes. Elections were held in the winter of 1945-46. 114. Election campaign for nationalistic aims. The most significant feature of the election campaign was that it sought to mobilize the Indians against the British. The election campaign expressed the nationalist sentiments against the state repression of the 1942 Quit India upsurge. This was done by glorifying martyrs and condemning officials. Congress support for INA prisoners. At the first post-war Congress session in September 1945 at Bombay, a strong resolution was adopted declaring Congress support for the INA cause. Defense of INA prisoners in the court was organized by Bhulabhai Desai, Tej Bahadur Sapru, Kailash Nath Kaju, Jawaharlal Nehru and Asaf Ali. INA Relief and Inquiry Committee distributed small sums of money and food, and helped arrange employment for the affected. Fund collection was organized. The INA agitation, a landmark on many counts. Celebrations of INA Day, November 12, 1945, and INA Week, November 5-11. Nerve centers of the agitation were Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, United Provinces towns and Punjab. The campaign spread to distant places such as Coorg, Baluchistan and Assam. The forms of participation included fund contributions made by many people. 3 upsurges. Winter of 1945-46 there were 3 major upsurges. November 21, 1945, in Calcutta over the INA trials. February 11, 1946, in Calcutta against the 7-year sentence to INA officer Rashid Ali. February 18, 1946, in Bombay, strike by the Royal Indian Navy ratings. 3-stage pattern. Stage 1. When a group defies authority and is repressed. In the first instance of this stage, November 21, 1945, a student procession had joined up with the League and the Congress, tied flags as a symbol of anti-imperialist unity, marched to Dalhousie Square, the seat of government in Calcutta. In the next step, February 11, 1946, the protest was led by Muslim League students in which some Congress and Communist students' organizations joined. Some arrests provoked the students to defy Section 144. Rebellion by naval ratings. On February 18, 1946, some 1,100 Royal Indian Navy (RIN) ratings of HMIS Talwar went on a strike to protest against racial discrimination, unpalatable food, abuse by superior officers, arrest of a rating for scrawling, "Quit India," on HMIS Talwar, INA trials and use of Indian troops in Indonesia, demanding their withdrawal. B. Stage 2. When the city people join in this phase was marked by a virulent anti-British mood resulting in the virtual paralysis of Calcutta and Bombay. C. Stage 3. When people in other parts of the country expressed sympathy and solidarity while the students boycotted classes and organized hartals and processions to express sympathy with other students and the ratings, there were sympathetic strikes. Evaluation of potential and impact of the three upsurges. A. Fearless action by the masses was an expression of militancy in the popular mind. B. Revolt in the armed forces had a great liberating effect on the minds of people. C. RIN revolt was seen as an event marking the end of British rule. These upsurges prompted the British to extend some concessions. On December 1, 1946, the government announced that only those INA members accused of murder or brutal treatment of fellow prisoners would be brought to trial. B. Imprisonment sentences passed against the first batch were remitted in January 1947. www.desireyes.com Mailid, caredesireyes@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. C. Indian soldiers were withdrawn from Indochina and Indonesia by February 1947. D. Decision to send a parliamentary delegation to India, November 1946, was taken. E. Decision to send cabinet mission was taken in January 1946. 115. Congress strategy. The leftists claim that the Congress' indifference to the revolutionary situation arose because of two considerations: that the situation would go out of its control and that a disciplined armed forces were vital in a free India. IV. Election results. Performance of the Congress. A. It got 91% of non-Muslim votes. B. It captured 57 out of 102 seats in the Central Assembly. C. In the provincial elections, it got a majority in most provinces except in Bengal, Sindh and Punjab. The Congress majority provinces included the NWFP and Assam, which were being claimed for Pakistan. Muslim League's performance. A. It got 86.6% of the Muslim votes. B. It captured the 30 reserved seats in the Central Assembly. C. In the provincial elections, it got a majority in Bengal and Sindh. D. Unlike in 1937, now the League clearly established itself as the dominant party among Muslims. E. In Punjab, a Unionist Congress Akali coalition under Qizar Hayat Khan assumed power. Significant features of elections. Elections witnessed communal voting in contrast to the strong anti-British unity shown in various upsurges due to A. Separate electorates, and B. Limited franchise. For the provinces, less than 10% of the population could vote, and for the Central Assembly. V. The Cabinet Mission. Attlee government announced in February 1946 the decision to send a high-powered mission of 3 British cabinet members. Why British withdrawal seemed imminent now. A. Success of nationalist forces in the struggle for hegemony was fairly evident by the end of the war. Nationalism had penetrated into hitherto untouched sections and areas. B. There was a demonstration in favor of nationalism among the bureaucracy and the loyalist sections, because the paucity of European ICS recruits and a policy of Indianization had ended the British domination of the ICS, and by 1939, there existed a British-Indian parity. C. British strategy of conciliation and repression had its limitations and contradictions. After the Cripps offer, there was little left to offer for conciliation except full freedom. When non-violent resistance was repressed with force, the naked force behind the government stood exposed, while if the government did not clamp down on sedition, or made offers for truce, it was seen to be unable to wield authority, and its prestige suffered. Efforts to woo the Congress dismayed the Loyalists. This policy of an unclear mix presented a dilemma for the services, who nevertheless had to implement it. The prospect of Congress ministries coming to power in the provinces further compounded this dilemma. Constitutionalism or Congress Raj had proved to be a big morale booster and helped in deeper penetration of patriotic sentiments among the masses. Demands of leniency for INA prisoners from within the army and the revolt of the RIN ratings had raised fears that the armed forces may not be as reliable if the Congress started a 1942-type mass movement, this time aided by the provincial ministries. www.desirreus.com Mailid, caredesirreus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 116. Only alternative to an all-out repression of a mass movement was an entirely official rule which seemed impossible now because the necessary numbers and efficient officials were not available. Government realized that a settlement was necessary for burying the ghost of a mass movement and for good future Indo-British relations. On the eve of Cabinet Mission Plan, the Congress demanded that power be transferred to one center and that minorities' demands be worked out in a framework ranging from autonomy to Muslim-majority provinces to self-determination or secession from the Indian Union, but only after the British left. Cabinet Mission arrives. The Cabinet Mission reached Delhi on March 24, 1946. It had prolonged discussions with Indian leaders of all parties and groups on the issues of interim government, and principles and procedures for framing a new constitution giving freedom to India. Cabinet Mission Plan, main points. Rejection of the demand for a full-fledged Pakistan. Grouping of existing provincial assemblies into three sections. Section A, Madras, Bombay, Central Provinces, United Provinces, Bihar and Orissa, Hindu-majority provinces. Section B, Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province and Sindh, Muslim-majority provinces. Section C, Bengal and Assam, Muslim-majority provinces. C, three-tier executive and legislature at provincial, section and union levels. D, a constituent assembly was to be elected by provincial assemblies by proportional representation. This constituent assembly would be a 389-member body. In the Constituent Assembly, members from Groups A, B and C were to sit separately to decide the constitution for provinces and if possible, for the groups also. Then, the whole Constituent Assembly would sit together to formulate the Union Constitution. A common center would control defense, communication and external affairs. A federal structure was envisaged for India. Communal questions in the central legislature were to be decided by a simple majority of both communities present and voting. Provinces were to have full autonomy and residual powers. Princely states were no longer to be under paramountcy of the British government. They would be free to enter into an arrangement with successor governments or the British government. After the first general elections, a province was to be free to come out of a group, and after 10 years, a province was to be free to call for a reconsideration of the group or the Union Constitution. Meanwhile, an interim government was to be formed from the Constituent Assembly. Different interpretations of the grouping clause. Congress. To the Congress, the Cabinet Mission Plan was against the creation of Pakistan since grouping was optional. One constituent assembly was envisaged, and the League no longer had a veto. Muslim League. The Muslim League believed Pakistan to be implied in compulsory grouping. Main objections. Congress. Provinces should not have to wait till the first general elections to come out of a group. They should have the option of not joining a group in the first place. Compulsory grouping contradicts the oft-repeated insistence on provincial autonomy. Absence of provision for elected members from the princely states in the constituent. League Assembly was not acceptable. Grouping should be compulsory with sections B and C developing into solid entities with a view to future secession into Pakistan. Acceptance and rejection. www.desirous.com Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 117. A Muslim League on June 6 and the Congress on June 24, 1946 accepted the long-term plan put forward by the Cabinet Mission. B. July 1946 elections were held in provincial assemblies for the Constituent Assembly. C. July 10, 1946 Nehru stated, "We are not bound by a single thing except that we have decided to go into the Constituent Assembly." The big probability is that there would be no grouping as NWFP and Assam would have objections to joining sections B and C. D. July 29, 1946 The League withdrew its acceptance of the long-term plan in response to Nehru's statement and gave a call for direct action from August 16 to achieve Pakistan. Vi. Communal Holocaust and the Interim Government. From August 16, 1946, the Indian scene was rapidly transformed. There were communal riots on an unprecedented scale, which left around several thousands dead. The worst-hit areas were Calcutta, Bombay, Noakhali, Bihar and Garmukteshwar, United Provinces. Changed government priorities. Wavell was now eager to somehow get the Congress into the interim government, even if the League stayed out. Interim government fearing mass action by the Congress, a Congress-dominated interim government headed by Nehru was sworn in on September 2, 1946. Wavell quietly brought the Muslim League into the interim government on October 26, 1946. The League was allowed to join A. Without giving up the direct action. B. Despite its rejection of the Cabinet Mission's long-term and short-term plans, and C. Despite insistence on compulsory grouping with decisions being taken by a majority vote by a section as a whole. Obstructionist approach and ulterior motives of League. The League did not attend the Constituent Assembly, which had its first meeting on December 9, 1946. Consequently, the Assembly had to confine itself to passing a general objectives resolution, drafted by Jawaharlal Nehru. In February 1947, 9 Congress members of the Cabinet wrote to the Viceroy demanding the resignation of League members and threatening the withdrawal of their own nominees. 7. Birth and spread of communalism in India. Characteristic features of Indian communalism. Communalism, more accurately, sectarianism, is basically an ideology which gives more importance to one's own ethnic, religious group rather than to the wider society as a whole, evolved through 3 broad stages in India. A. Communal nationalism, the notion that since a group or a section of people belong to a particular religious community, their secular interests are the same, i.e., even those matters which have got nothing to do with religion affect all of them equally. B. Liberal communalism, the notion that since 2 religious communities have different religious interests, they have different interests in the secular sphere also, i.e., in economic, political and cultural spheres. C. Extreme communalism, the notion that not only do different religious communities have different interests, but also that these interests are incompatible, i.e., 2 communities cannot coexist because the interests of one community come into conflict with those of the other. Reasons for growth of communalism. A. Socio-economic reasons. B. British policy of divide and rule. C. Communalism in history writing. D. Side effects of socio-religious reform movements. Reform movements such as the Wahhabi movement among Muslims and Shuddhi among Hindus with their militant overtones made the role of religion more vulnerable to communalism. E. Side effects of militant nationalism. Communal reaction by majority community. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, was established in 1925. www.desirous.com Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 118. Evolution of the two-nation theory. The development of the two-nation theory over the years is as follows. 1887, Syed Ahmed Khan appealed to the educated Muslims to stay away from the Congress, although some Muslims did join the Congress. B. 1906, Aga Khan led a Muslim delegation, called the Shimla Delegation, to the Viceroy, Lord Minto, to demand separate electorates for Muslims at all levels. C. 1909, separate electorates were awarded under Morley Minto reforms. Punjab Hindu Sabha was founded by UN Mukherjee and Lal Chand. D. 1915, first session of All India Hindu Mahasabha was held under the aegis of the Maharaja of Kasam Bazar. E. 1912-24, during this period, the Muslim League was dominated by younger Muslim nationalists, but their nationalism was inspired by a communal view of political questions. F. 1916, the Congress accepted the Muslim League demand of separate electorates and the Congress and the League presented joint demands to the government. G. 1920-22, Muslims participated in the Rowlatt and Khilafat non-cooperation agitations, but there was a communal element in the political outlook of the Muslims. H. 1920s, the shadow of communal riots loomed large over the country. I. 1928, the Nehru Report on constitutional reforms as suggested by the Congress was opposed by Muslim hardliners and the Sikh League. J. By negotiating with the Muslim League, the Congress made a number of mistakes. 1. It gave legitimacy to the politics of the League, thus giving recognition to the division of society into separate communities with separate interests. 2. It undermined the role of secular, nationalist Muslims. 3. Concessions to one community prompted other communities to demand similar concessions. 4. Launching an all-out attack on communalism became difficult. K. 1930-34, some Muslim groups, such as the Jamaat-e-Ulema-i Hind, State of Kashmir and Khudai-Khidmatgars participated in the civil disobedience movement, but overall the participation of Muslims was nefarious and did all three of them. L. 1932, the communal award accepted all Muslim communal demands contained in the 14 points. M. After 1937, after the Muslim League performed badly in the 1937 provincial elections, it decided to resort to extreme communalism. There were several reasons for the advent of extreme communalism. 1. With increasing radicalization, the reactionary elements searched for a social base through channels of communalism. 2. The colonial administration had exhausted all other means to divide nationalists. 3. Earlier failures to challenge communal tendencies had emboldened the communal forces. N. 1937-39, Jinnah blocked all avenues for conciliation by forwarding the impossible demand that the Congress should declare itself a Hindu organization and recognize the Muslim League as the sole representative of the Indian Muslims. O. March 24, 1940, the Pakistan Resolution was passed at the Lahore session of the Muslim League. P. During Second World War, the British India government gave a virtual veto to the League on political settlement. Space for your notes. www.desireyes.com Mailid, caredesireyes@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 119. Chapter 25 Independence with Partition Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains, www.desireyes.com. I. Attlee's Statement of February 20, 1947. Main points of Attlee's Statement. A deadline of June 30, 1948 was fixed for transfer of power even if the Indian politicians had not agreed by that time on the constitution. B. British would relinquish power either to some form of central government or in some areas to the existing provincial governments if the Constituent Assembly was not fully representative, i.e., if the Muslim majority provinces did not join. C. British powers and obligations vis-a-vis the princely states would lapse with transfer of power, but these would not be transferred to any successor government in British India. D. Mountbatten would replace Wavell as the Viceroy. The statement contained clear hints of partition and even balkanization of the country into numerous states and was, in essence, a reversion of the Crips offer. Why a date fixed by government for withdrawal? A. Government hoped that a fixed date would shock the parties into an agreement on the main question. B. Government was keen to avert the developing constitutional crisis. C. Government hoped to convince the Indians of British sincerity. D. Truth in Wavell's assessment could no longer be denied. Congress stand provision of transfer of power to more than one center was acceptable to Congress because it meant that the existing assembly could go ahead and frame a constitution for the areas represented by it, and it offered a way out of the existing deadlock. 2. Independence and partition. On March 10, 1947, Nehru stated that the cabinet missions was the best solution if carried out. The only real alternative was the partition of Punjab and Bengal. In April 1947, the Congress President, Kripalani, communicated to the Viceroy Mountbatten as the Viceroy Mountbatten proved more firm and quick in taking decisions than his predecessors because he was informally given more powers to decide things on the spot. His task was to explore the options of unity and division till October 1947 and then advise the British government on the form of transfer of power. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. Mountbatten Plan, June 3, 1947. 120. A. Punjab and Bengal legislative assemblies would meet in two groups, Hindus and Muslims, to vote for partition. If a simple majority of either group voted for partition, then these provinces would be partitioned. B. In case of partition, two dominions and two constituent assemblies would be created. C. Sindh would take its own decision. D. Referendums in NWFP and Sylhet district of Bengal would decide the fate of these areas. E. Since the Congress had conceded a unified India, all their other points would be met, namely, 1. Independence for princely states ruled out, they would join either India or Pakistan. 2. Independence for Bengal ruled out. 3. Accession of Hyderabad to Pakistan ruled out. 4. Freedom to come on August 15, 1947, and 5. A boundary commission to be set up if partition was to be effected. F. Why Congress accepted Dominion status. 1. It would ensure a peaceful and quick transfer of power. 2. It was more important for the Congress to assume authority to check the explosive situation, and 3. It would allow for some much-needed continuity in the bureaucracy and the army. G. Rationale for an early date, August 15, 1947, the plan was put into effect without the slightest delay. The legislative assemblies of Bengal and Punjab decided in favor of partition of these two provinces. Thus, East Bengal and West Punjab joined Pakistan, West Bengal and East Punjab remained with the Indian Union. Indian Independence Act. On July 5, 1947, the British Parliament passed the Indian Independence Act, which was based on the Mountbatten Plan, and the Act got royal assent on June 18, 1947. Act was implemented on August 15, 1947. Act provided for the creation of two independent dominions of India and Pakistan with effect from August 15, 1947. As per the provisions of the Indian Independence Act, 1947, Pakistan became independent on August 14. While India got its freedom on August 15, 1947. Jinnah became the first Governor-General of Pakistan. India, however, decided to request Lord Mountbatten to continue as the Governor-General of India. Problems of early withdrawal. Breakneck speed of events under Mountbatten caused anomalies in arranging the details of partition and totally failed to prevent the Punjab massacre, because there were no transitional institutional structures within which partition problems could be tackled. B. Mountbatten had hoped to be the common Governor-General of India and Pakistan, thus providing the necessary link, but Jinnah wanted the position for himself in Pakistan. C. There was a delay in announcing the Boundary Commission Award, under Radcliffe. Though the award was ready by August 12, 1947, Mountbatten decided to make it public after August 15 so that the British could escape all responsibility of disturbances. Integration of states. In July 1947, Vallabhbhai Patel took charge of the new States Department. Under Patel, the incorporation of Indian states took place in two phases with a skillful combination of baits and threats of mass pressure in both. B. Phase 1. By August 15, 1947, all states except Kashmir, Hyderabad and Junagadh had signed an instrument of accession with the Indian government. C. Phase 2. Second phase involved a much more difficult process of integration of states with neighboring provinces or into new units. 3. Inevitability of partition. www.desirous.com Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 121. Why Congress accepted partition. Congress was only accepting the inevitable due to the long-term failure to draw the Muslim masses into the national movement. The Congress had a twofold task: I. Structuring diverse classes, communities, groups and regions into a nation, and E. Securing independence for this nation. B. Only an immediate transfer of power could forestall the spread of direct action and communal violence. The virtual collapse of the interim government also made the notion of Pakistan appear unavoidable. C. Partition plan ruled out independence for the princely states, which could have been a greater danger to Indian unity as it would have meant balkanization of the country. D. Acceptance of partition was only a final act of the process of step-by-step concessions to the League's championing of a separate Muslim state. E. When CWC resolution stated that Punjab, and by implication, Bengal, must be partitioned if the country was divided, and with the 3rd of June plan, Congress accepted partition. F. While loudly asserting the sovereignty of the Constituent Assembly, the Congress quietly accepted compulsory grouping and accepted the partition most of all because it could not stop the communal riots. Gandhi's helplessness. Gandhi felt helpless because there had been a communalization of the people. He had no option but to accept partition because the people wanted it. Space for your notes. www.desirous.com Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 122. Other links. All history notes. https://www.desirous.com/tamil-nadu-ensit-notes/telegram link https://t.me/desirous Facebook link https://www.youtube.com/watch V equals dun 88 CVT4XO and list equals plex 2 HVZBJX Ojtobe 49 CM Vitvil Chapter 26 Constitutional, Administrative and Judicial Developments Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains. I. Constitutional Development between 1773 and 1858. After Battle of Buxar, 1764, East India Company got the Diwani, right to collect revenue, of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. 1767 The first intervention in Indian affairs by the British government came in 1767. 1765–72 This period was characterized by a. Rampant corruption among servants of the company who made full use of private trading to enrich themselves. B. Excessive revenue collection and oppression of peasantry. C. Companies' bankruptcy, while the servants were flourishing. The Regulating Act of 1773. A. British government's involvement in Indian affairs in the effort to control and regulate the functioning of the East India Company. It recognized that the company's role in India extended beyond mere trade to administrative and political fields, and introduced the element of centralized administration. B. Directors of the company were required to submit all correspondence regarding revenue affairs and civil and military administration to the government. C. In Bengal, the administration was to be carried out by Governor General and a council consisting of 4 members, representing civil and military government. They were required to function according to the majority rule. D. A Supreme Court of Judicature was to be established in Bengal with original and appellate jurisdictions where all subjects could seek redressal. In practice, however, the Supreme Court had a debatable jurisdiction vis-a-vis the council, which created various problems. E. Governor General could exercise some powers over Bombay and Madras, again, a vague provision which created many problems. F. Amendments, 1781. Jurisdiction of the Supreme Court was defined. Within Calcutta, it was to administer the personal law of the defendant. Servants of the government were immune if they did anything while discharging the duties. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. Social and religious usages of the subjects were to be honored. Pitt's India Act of 1784. 123. A company became a subordinate department of the state. The company's territories in India were termed British possessions. B. A board of control consisting of the Chancellor of Exchequer, a Secretary of State and 4 members of the Privy Council, to be appointed by the Crown, were to exercise control over the company's civil, military and revenue affairs. All dispatches were to be approved by the board. Thus a dual system of control was set up. C. In India, the Governor-General was to have a council of 3, including the Commander-in-Chief, and the presidencies of Bombay and Madras were made subordinate to the Governor-General. D. A general prohibition was placed on aggressive wars and treaties, breached often. The Act of 1786. A. Cornwallis wanted to have the powers of both the Governor-General and the Commander-in-Chief. The new act conceded this demand and also gave him the power. B. Cornwallis was allowed to override the council's decision if he owned the responsibility for the decision. Later, this provision was extended to all the governors-general. The Charter Act of 1793. The act renewed the company's commercial privileges for next 20 years. B. The company, after paying the necessary expenses, interest, dividends, salaries, etc., from the Indian revenues, was to pay £5 lakh annually to the British government. C. The royal approval was mandated for the appointment of the Governor-General, the governors, and the Commander-in-Chief. D. Senior officials of the company were debarred from leaving India without permission. Doing so was treated as resignation. E. The company was empowered to give licenses to individuals as well as the company's employees to trade in India. The licenses, known as privilege or country trade, paved the way for shipments of opium to China. F. The revenue administration was separated from the judiciary functions, and this led to disappearing of the Mal Adalats. G. The home government members were to be paid out of Indian revenues, which continued up to 1919. The Charter Act of 1813. The company's monopoly over trade in India ended, but the company retained the trade with China and the trade in tea. B. The company's shareholders were given a 10.5% dividend on the revenue of India. The company was to retain the possession of territories and the revenue for 20 years more, without prejudice to the sovereignty of the Crown. C. Powers of the Board of Control were further enlarged. D. A sum of 1 lakh rupees was to be set aside for the revival, promotion and encouragement of literature, learning and science among the natives of India, every year. E. The regulations made by the councils of Madras, Bombay and Calcutta were now required to be laid before the British Parliament. The constitutional position of the British territories in India was thus explicitly defined for the first time. F. Separate accounts were to be kept regarding commercial transactions and territorial revenues. The power of superintendence and direction of the Board of Control was not only defined but also enlarged considerably. G. Christian missionaries were also permitted to come to India and preach their religion. The Charter Act of 1833. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. 124. A lease of 20 years to the company was further extended. Territories of India were to be governed in the name of the Crown. B. Company's monopoly over trade with China and India also ended. C. All restrictions on European immigration and the acquisition of property in India were lifted. D. In India, a financial, legislative and administrative centralization of the government was envisaged. Governor-General was given the power to superintend, control and direct all civil and military affairs of the company. Bengal, Madras, Bombay and all other territories were placed under complete control of the Governor-General. All revenues were to be raised under the authority of the Governor-General, who would have complete control over the expenditure too. Governments of Madras and Bombay were drastically deprived of their legislative powers and left with a right of proposing to the Governor-General the projects of law which they thought to be expedient. A law member was added to the Governor-General's Council for professional advice on lawmaking. F. Indian laws were to be codified and consolidated. G. No Indian citizen was to be denied employment under the company on the basis of religion, color, birth, descent, etc. H. Administration was urged to take steps to ameliorate the conditions of slaves and to ultimately abolish slavery. Slavery was abolished in 1843. The Charter Act of 1853. A company was to continue possession of territories unless the Parliament provided otherwise. B. Strength of the Court of Directors was reduced to 18. C. Company's patronage over the services was dissolved. The services were now thrown open to a competitive examination. D. Law member became the full member of the Governor-General's Executive Council. E. Separation of the executive and legislative functions of the Government of British India progressed with the inclusion of 6 additional members for legislative purposes. The Act for Better Government of India, 1858. India was to be governed by and in the name of the Crown through a Secretary of State and a Council of 15. The initiative and the final decision was to be with the Secretary of State and the Council was to be just advisory in nature. B. Governor-General became the Viceroy too. Developments after 1858 till Independence. Indian Councils Act, 1861. The 1861 Act marked an advance in that the principle of representatives of non-officials in legislative bodies became accepted. Laws were to be made after due deliberation, and as pieces of legislation they could be changed only by the same deliberative process. B. The portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning laid the foundations of cabinet government in India, each branch of the administration having its official head and spokesman in the government, who was responsible for its administration. C. The Act by vesting legislative powers in the governments of Bombay and Madras and by making provision for the institution of similar legislative councils in other provinces laid the foundations of legislative devolution. Indian Councils Act, 1892. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded. The Congress saw reform of the councils as the root of all other reforms. It was in response to the Congress demand that the legislative www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. 125. Councils be expanded that the number of non-official members was increased both in the central, imperial, and provincial legislative councils by the Indian Councils Act, 1892. B. Legislative Council of the Governor-General was enlarged. C. Universities, district boards, municipalities, Zamindars, trade bodies and chambers of commerce were empowered to recommend members to the provincial councils. Thus was introduced the principle of representation. D. Though the term election was firmly avoided in the Act, an element of indirect election was accepted in the selection of some of the non-official members. E. Members of the legislatures were now entitled to express their views upon financial statements which were henceforth to be made on the floor of the legislatures. F. Could also put questions within certain limits to the executive on matters of public interest after giving 6 days' notice. Indian Councils Act, 1909. Popularly known as the Morley-Minto Reforms, the Act made the first attempt to bring in a representative and popular element in the governance of the country. B. Strength of the Imperial Legislative Council was increased. C. With regard to the central government, an Indian member was taken for the first time in the Executive Council of the Governor-General. D. Members of the Provincial Executive Council were increased. E. Powers of the legislative councils, both central and provincial, were increased. Government of India Act, 1919. This act was based on what are popularly known as the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. B. Under the 1919 Act, the Indian Legislative Council at the centre was replaced by a bicameral system consisting of a Council of State, Upper House, and a Legislative Assembly, Lower House. Each house was to have a majority of members who were directly elected. So, direct election was introduced, though the franchise was much restricted, being based on qualifications of property, tax, or education. C. Principle of communal representation was extended with separate electorates for Sikhs, Christians and Anglo-Indians, besides Muslims. D. Act introduced Jharchi in the provinces, which indeed was a substantial step towards transfer of power to the Indian people. E. Provincial legislature was to consist of one house only, Legislative Council. F. Act separated for the first time the provincial and central budgets, with provincial legislatures being authorized to make their budgets. G. A High Commissioner for India was appointed, who was to hold his office in London for 6 years and whose duty was to look after Indian trade in Europe. H. Secretary of State for India, who used to get his pay from the Indian Revenue, was now to be paid by the British Exchequer, thus undoing an injustice in the Charter Act of 1793. I. Though Indian leaders for the first time got some administrative experience in a constitutional set-up under this Act. Simon Commission. A 1919 Act had provided that a Royal Commission would be appointed 10 years after the Act to report on its working. 3 round-table conferences were called by the British government to consider the proposals. Subsequently, a white paper on constitutional reforms was published by the British government in March 1933. Government of India Act, 1935. A. Act, with 451 clauses and 15 schedules, contemplated the establishment of an all-India federation in which governors' provinces and the chief commissioners' provinces and those Indian states which might accede to be united were to be included. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. B. Jharchi, rejected by the Simon Commission, was provided for in the Federal Executive. 126. C. Federal legislature was to have 2 chambers, bicameral, the Council of States and the Federal Legislative Assembly. The Council of States, the upper house, was to be a permanent body. D. There was a provision for joint sitting in cases of deadlock between the houses. There were to be 3 subject lists, the Federal Legislative List, the Provincial Legislative List and the Concurrent Legislative List. Residuary, legislative powers were subject to the discretion of the Governor-General. E. Jharchi in the provinces was abolished and provinces were given autonomy. F. Provincial legislatures were further expanded. Bicameral legislatures were provided in the 6 provinces of Madras, Bombay, Bengal, United Provinces, Bihar and Assam, with other 5 provinces retaining unicameral legislatures. G. Principles of communal electorates and weightage were further extended to depressed classes, women and labor. H. Franchise was extended, with about 10% of the total population getting the right to vote. I. Act also provided for a federal court, which was established in 1937, with original and appellate powers, to interpret the 1935 Act and settle interstate disputes, but the Privy Council in London was to dominate this court. J. India Council of the Secretary of State was abolished. K. All India Federation as visualized in the Act never came into being because of the opposition from different parties of India. The British government decided to introduce the provincial autonomy on April 1, 1937, but the central government continued to be governed in accordance with the 1919 Act, with minor amendments. The operative part of the Act of 1935 remained in force till August 15, 1947. 3. Evolution of civil services in India. Cornwallis Roll Cornwallis, Governor-General, 1786–93, was the first to bring into existence and organize the civil services. He tried to check corruption through a. Raising the civil servant's salary. b. Strict enforcement of rules against private trade. c. Debarring civil servants from taking presents, bribes etc. d. Enforcing promotions through seniority. Wellesley's role in 1800, Wellesley, Governor-General, 1798–1805, set up the Fort William College for training of new recruits. In 1806 Wellesley's college was disapproved by the Court of Directors and instead the East India College was set up at Haileybury in England to impart 2 years training to the recruits. Charter Act of 1853. The reasons for exclusion of Indians were a. Belief that only the English could establish administrative services serving British interests. b. Belief that the Indians were incapable, untrustworthy and insensitive to the British interests. c. Fact there was high competition among the Europeans themselves for lucrative posts, so why offer them to the Indians? Indian Civil Service Act, 1861. The maximum permissible age was gradually reduced from 23, in 1859, to 22, in 1860, to 21, in 1866, and to 19, 1878. In 1863, Satchendra Nath Tagore became the first Indian to qualify for the Indian Civil Service. Statutory Civil Service in 1878–79, Lytton introduced the statutory civil service consisting of 1/6 of covenanted posts to be filled by Indians. Congress Demand and Aitchison Committee. The Indian National Congress raised the demand, after it was set up in 1885, for lowering of age limit for recruitment, and holding the examination simultaneously in India and Britain. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. b. The Aitchison Committee on Public Services, 1886, set up by Dufferin, recommended dropping of the terms covenanted and uncovenanted. 127. Classification of the civil service into Imperial Indian Civil Service, examination in England, Provincial Civil Service, examination in India, and subordinate civil service, examination in India, and raising the age limit to 23. In 1893, the House of Commons in England passed a resolution supporting holding of simultaneous examination in India and England, but the resolution was never implemented. Montford Reforms, 1919, the Montford Reforms stated a realistic policy recommended holding of simultaneous examination in India and England. b. Recommended that 1/3 of recruitments be made in India itself, to be raised annually by 1.5%. Lee Commission, 1924, the Lee Commission recommended that a. Secretary of State should continue to recruit the ICS, the irrigation branch of the Service of Engineers, the Indian Forest Service, etc. b. Recruitments for the transferred fields like education and civil medical service be made by provincial governments. c. Direct recruitment to ICS on basis of 50-50 parity between the Europeans and the Indians be reached in 15 years. d. A Public Service Commission be immediately established. Government of India Act, 1935 Act recommended the establishment of a Federal Public Service Commission and Provincial Public Service Commission under their spheres. Evaluation of civil services under British rule. This was done in mainly two ways. Firstly, the maximum age for appearing at the examination was reduced from 23 in 1859 to 19 in 1878 under Lytton. Secondly, all key positions of power and authority and those which were well paid were occupied by the Europeans. IV. Evolution of police system in modern India. Watchguards since time immemorial protecting villages at night. Under the Mughal rule there were the Faujdars and Amils. The Kotwal was responsible for maintenance of law and order in the cities. In Bengal, Bihar and Orissa between 1765 and 1772 the Zamindars were expected to maintain the staff including Thaindars. In 1775, Faujdar Thanas were established. 1791 Cornwallis organized a regular police force to maintain law and order by going back to and modernizing the old Indian system of thanas, circles, in a district under a daroga, an Indian, and a superintendent of police, SP. 1808 Mayo appointed an SP through each division helped by a number of spies, goyendas. Recommendations of the Police Commission, 1860, led to the Indian Police Act, 1861. The Commission recommended a system of civil constabulary, maintaining the village setup in the present form, a village watchman maintained by the village, but in direct relationship with the rest of the constabulary. b. Inspector General as the head in a province, Deputy Inspector General as the head in a range, and SP as the head in a district. 1902 The Police Commission recommended the establishment of CIDV. Military under the British. Prior to the revolt of 1857, there were two separate sets of military forces under the British control, which operated in India. The first set of units, known as the Queen's Army, were the serving troops on www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 128. Duty in India. The other was the Company's troops, a mixture of European regiments of Britons and native regiments recruited locally from India but with British officers. The Queen's Army was part of Crown's military force. On the whole, the British Indian Army remained a costly military machine. Vi. Development of judiciary in British India. Beginning of a common law system, based on recorded judicial precedents, can be traced to the establishment of Mayor's Courts in Madras, Bombay and Calcutta in 1726 by the East India Company. Reforms under Warren Hastings, 1772–1785. District Diwani Adalats were established in districts to try civil disputes. These adalats were placed under the collector and had Hindu law applicable for Hindus and the Muslim law for Muslims. The appeal from District Diwani Adalats lay to the Sadar Diwani Adalat, which functioned under a president and two members of the Supreme Council. b. District Faujdari Adalats were set up to try criminal disputes and were placed under an Indian officer assisted by Qazis and Muftis. These Adalats also were under the general supervision of the collector. Muslim law was administered in Faujdari Adalats. c. Under the Regulating Act of 1773, the Supreme Court was established at Calcutta, which was competent to try all British subjects within Calcutta and the subordinate factories, including Indians and Europeans. It had original and appellate jurisdictions. Often, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court clashed with that of other courts. Reforms under Cornwallis, 1786–1793, separation of powers. Circuit courts were established at Calcutta, Dhaka, Murshidabad and Patna. These circuit courts had European judges and were to act as courts of appeal for both civil and criminal cases. Sadar Nizamat Adalat was shifted to Calcutta and was put under the Governor-General and members of the Supreme Council assisted by the Chief Qazi and the Chief Mufti. The district Diwani Adalat was now designated as the district, city or the Zilla court and placed under a district judge. The collector was now responsible only for the revenue administration with no magisterial functions. A gradation of civil courts was established, for both Hindu and Muslim laws, Munsif's court under Indian offices, Registrar's court under a European judge, district court under the district judge. 4 circuit courts as provincial courts of appeal, Sadar Diwani Adalat at Calcutta, and King in Council for appeals of £5,000 and above. The Cornwallis Code was laid out. There was a separation of revenue and justice administration. European subjects were also brought under jurisdiction. Government officials were answerable to the civil courts for actions done in their official capacity. Principle of sovereignty of law was established. Reforms under William Bentinck, 1828–1833. 4 circuit courts were abolished and their functions transferred to collectors under the supervision of the Commissioner of Revenue and Circuit. Sadar Diwani Adalat and the Sadar Nizamat Adalat were set up at Allahabad for the convenience of the people of upper provinces. Till now, Persian was the official language in courts. Now, the suitor had the option to use Persian or a vernacular language, while in the Supreme Court, English language replaced Persian. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 129. 1833, a law commission was set up under Macaulay for codification of Indian laws. As a result, a Civil Procedure Code, 1859, an Indian Penal Code, 1860, and a Criminal Procedure Code, 1861, were prepared. Later developments. 1860, it was provided that the Europeans can claim no special privileges except in criminal cases, and no judge of an Indian origin could try them. 1865, Supreme Court and the Sadar Adalats were merged into 3 high courts at Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. 1935, Government of India Act provided for a federal court, set up in 1937, which could settle disputes between governments and could hear limited appeals from the high courts. Evaluation. Positive aspects of judiciary under the British rule of law was established. Codified laws replaced the religious and personal laws of the rulers. Even European subjects were brought under the jurisdiction, although in criminal cases they could be tried by European judges only. Government servants were made answerable to the civil courts. The negative aspects. Judicial system became more and more complicated and expensive. The rich could manipulate the system. There was ample scope for false evidence, deceit and chicanery. Dragged-out litigation meant delayed justice. Courts became overburdened as litigation increased. Often, the European judges were not familiar with the Indian usage and traditions. 7. Major changes in administrative structure after 1857. Genesis of administrative changes. New stage of colonialism. There was a renewed upsurge of imperial control and imperialist ideology which was reflected in the reactionary policies during the viceroyalties of Lytton, Dufferin, Lansdowne, Elgin and, above all, Curzon. The changes in the governmental structure and policies in India were to shape the destiny of modern India in many ways. 8. Administration, central, provincial, local central government. Act for Better Government of India, 1858 transferred the power to govern from the East India Company to the British Crown. By Indian Councils Act, 1861, a fifth member, who was to be a jurist, was added to Viceroy's Executive Council. The Legislative Council so constituted possessed no real powers and was merely advisory in nature. Its weaknesses were as follows. It could not discuss important matters, and no financial matters at all without previous approval of the government. It had no control over the budget. It could not discuss executive action. Final passing of the bill needed the Viceroy's approval. Even if approved by the Viceroy, the Secretary of State could disallow legislation. Indians associated as non-officials were members of elite sections only, princes, landlords, diwans, etc., and were not representative of the Indian opinion. Viceroy could issue ordinances, of 6 months validity, in case of emergency. Provincial government. The Indian Councils Act, 1861 returned the legislative powers to provinces of Madras and Bombay which had been taken away in 1833. www.desirous.com Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 130. Local bodies. There were many factors which made it necessary for the British government in India to work towards establishing local bodies. A. Financial difficulties faced by the government, due to over-centralization, made decentralization imperative. B. It became necessary that modern advances in civic amenities in Europe be transplanted in India considering India's increasing economic contacts with Europe. C. Rising tide of nationalism had improvement in basic facilities as a point on its agenda. D. A section of British policy makers saw association of Indians with the administration in some form or the other, without undermining the British supremacy in India, as an instrument to check the increasing politicization of Indians. E. Utilization of local taxes for local welfare could be used to counter any public criticism of British reluctance to draw upon an already overburdened treasury or to tax the rich upper classes. Important stages in the evolution of local government can be identified as follows. A. Between 1864 and 1868 local bodies were first formed. B. Mayo's resolution of 1870. Financial decentralization was a legislative devolution inaugurated by the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Apart from the annual grant from imperial government, the provincial governments were authorized to resort to local taxation to balance their budgets. C. Ripon's resolution of 1882. Lord Ripon is called father of local self-government in India. The main points of the resolution were as follows. Development of local bodies advocated to improve the administration and as an instrument of political and popular education. Policy of administrating local affairs through urban and rural local bodies charged with definite duties and entrusted with suitable sources of revenues. Non-officials to be in majority in these bodies, who could be elected if the officials thought that it was possible to introduce elections. Non-officials to act as chairpersons to these bodies. Official interference to be reduced to the minimum and to be exercised to revise and check the acts of local bodies, but not to dictate policies. Official executive sanction required in certain cases, such as raising of loans, alienation of municipal property, imposition of new taxes, undertaking works costing more than a prescribed sum, framing rules and bylaws, etc. The existing local bodies had various drawbacks. Elected members were in a minority in all district boards and in many of the municipalities. Franchise was very limited. District boards continued to be headed by district officials, though non-officials gradually came to head the municipalities. Government retained strict control, and it could suspend or supersede these bodies at will. D. Royal Commission on Decentralization, 1908. The Commission made the following recommendations. It emphasized that village panchayats should be entrusted with more powers like judicial jurisdiction in petty cases, incurring expenditure on minor village works, village schools, small fuel and fodder reserves, etc. The panchayats should be given adequate sources of income. It emphasized the importance of sub-district boards to be established in every taluka or tehsil, with separate spheres of duties and separate sources of revenue for sub-district boards and the district boards. www.desireyus.com Mailid, caredesireyus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 131. It urged the withdrawal of existing restrictions on their powers of taxation, and also, the stoppage of regular grants in aid from provincial governments except for undertaking large projects. Municipalities might undertake the responsibility for primary education and, if willing, for middle vernacular schools. Otherwise the government should relieve them of any charges in regard to secondary education, hospitals, relief, police, veterinary works, etc. The Government of India Resolution of 1915. This resolution contained the official views on the recommendations of the Decentralization Commission. The Resolution of May 1918. This resolution reviewed the entire question of local self-government in the light of the announcement of August 20, 1917. Under Jharchi local self-government was made a transferred subject under Popular Ministerial Control by Government of India Act, 1919, and each province was allowed to develop local self-institutions according to provincial needs and requirements. The Government of India Act, 1935 and after the provincial autonomy ushered in by the Government of India Act, 1935 gave further impetus to the development of local self-governing institutions in India. Chapter 27 Survey of British Policies in India Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains, www.desireyus.com. Administrative Policies. Divide and rule. Determined to avoid a united mass action challenging their authority, the British rulers in India decided to practice a naked policy of divide and rule. Hostility towards educated Indians. At a time when the nationalist movement was born, Indian National Congress was founded in 1885, the British interpreted the moves as a challenge to their authority and adopted a hostile attitude to such leadership. Attitude towards the Zamindars. In their pursuit of reactionary policies and hope to expand their social base, the British looked for alliances with the most reactionary of social groups, the princes, Zamindars, etc. Attitude towards social reforms. Having decided to side with the reactionary elements of Indian society, the British withdrew support to social reforms. Underdeveloped social services. A disproportionately large expenditure on army and civil administration and the cost of wars left little to be spent on social services. Labor legislations. The Indian Factory Act, 1881 dealt primarily with the problem of child labor, between 7 and 12 years of age. Its significant provisions were: a. Employment of children under 7 years of age prohibited. b. Working hours restricted to 9 hours per day for children. c. Children to get 4 holidays in a month. d. Hazardous machinery to be properly fenced off. The Indian Factory Act, 1891. A. Increased the minimum age, from 7 to 9 years, and the maximum, from 12 to 14 years, for children. b. Reduced maximum working hours for children to 7 hours a day. www.desireyus.com Mailid, caredesireyus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 132. C. Fixed maximum working hours for women at 11 hours per day with an 1.5 hour interval. Working hours for men were left unregulated. D. Provided weekly holiday for all. Restrictions on freedom of the press. Lytton, fearing an increased influence of the nationalist press on public opinion, imposed restrictions on Indian language press through the infamous Vernacular Press Act, 1878. This act had to be repealed under public protest in 1882. White racism. The notion of white superiority was maintained very carefully by the colonial rulers by systematically excluding the Indians from higher grades of services, both civil and military. 2. British social and cultural policy in India. Emergence of new interests and ideas in Britain of the 19th century in the wake of significant changes in Europe during the 18th and the 19th centuries. Some of these changes were a. Industrial revolution which began in the 18th century and resulted in the growth of industrial capitalism. The rising industrial interests wanted to make India a big market for the goods and therefore required partial modernization and transformation of Indian society. B. Intellectual revolution which gave rise to new attitudes of mind, manners, and morals. C. French Revolution which with its message of liberty, equality and fraternity, unleashed the forces of democracy and nationalism. Characteristics of New Thought. Some of the characteristics of the new wave of thought were a. Rationalism which advocated faith in reason and a scientific attitude. B. Humanism which advocated the love of man. These ideals gave rise to liberalism, socialism and individualism. C. Doctrine of progress according to which nothing is static and all societies must change with time. Schools of thought. A. Conservatives advocated introduction of as few changes as possible. B. Paternalistic imperialists were sharply critical of Indian society and culture and used to justify economic and political enslavement of India. C. Radicals went beyond the narrow criticism and imperialistic outlook of the conservatives and the imperialists and applied advanced humanistic and rational thought to the Indian situation. Indian Renaissance. There were many Indians who instigated social reform and caused legislations to be brought about so as to control and eradicate social evils embedded in so-called tradition. Dilemma before the government. The government feared that too much modernization might generate forces hostile to their interests. Role of Christian missionaries. The missionaries regarded Christianity to be a superior religion and wanted to spread it in India through westernization. Towards this end, the Christian missionaries a. Supported the radicals whose scientific approach, they believed, would undermine the native culture and beliefs. B. Supported the imperialists since law and order and the British supremacy were essential for their propaganda, and C. Sought business and the capitalist support, holding out the hope to them that the Christian converts would be better customers of the goods. British retreat. The Indians proved to be apt pupils and shifted rapidly towards modernization of their society and assertion of their culture. 3. British policy towards princely states. Subordination of princely states to British authority was completed when the fiction of Indian states standing in a status of equality with the Crown as independent, sovereign states ended, with the Queen adopting the title of Kaiser-i-Hind, Queen Empress of India, in 1876, to emphasize British sovereignty over entire India. IV. British foreign policy in India. www.desiraeus.com. Mail id. caredesiraeus@gmail.com. Spectrum short notes. 133. Pursuance of a foreign policy to India's conflicts with neighboring countries. These conflicts arose due to various reasons. Firstly, political and administrative consolidation of the country. Secondly, the British government had as its major aims in Asia and Africa a. Protection of the invaluable Indian Empire. B. Expansion of British commercial and economic interests. C. Keeping other European imperialist powers, whose colonial interests came in conflict with those of the British, at an arm's length in Asia and Africa. Space for your notes. Chapter 28 Economic Impact of British Rule in India. Short notes, prelims plus mains, www.desiraeus.com. I. Deindustrialization, ruin of artisans and handicraftsmen. One-way free trade. Cheap and machine-made imports flooded the Indian market after the Charter Act of 1813 allowing one-way free trade for the British citizens. Tariffs of nearly 80% were imposed on Indian textiles so that Indian cloth could no longer be cheap. No steps towards modern industrialization. The loss of traditional livelihood was not accompanied by a process of industrialization in India. Ruralization. The feature of deindustrialization was the decline of many cities and a process of ruralization of India. 2. Impoverishment of peasantry. Transferability of land was one feature of the new settlement which caused great insecurity to the tenants who lost all their traditional rights in land. The peasant turned out to be the ultimate sufferer under the triple burden of the government, zamindar and moneylender. 3. Emergence of intermediaries, absentee landlordism, ruin of old zamindars. The new zamindars, with increased powers but with little or no avenues for new investments, resorted to land grabbing and sub-infeudation. Increase in number of intermediaries to be paid gave rise to absentee landlordism and increased the burden on the peasant. IV. Stagnation and deterioration of agriculture. The cultivator had neither the means nor any incentive to invest in agriculture. V. Famine and poverty. Regular recurrence of famines became a common feature of daily existence in India. www.desirous.com. Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com. Spectrum short notes. 134. Vi. Commercialization of Indian agriculture. Commercial crops like cotton, jute, groundnut, oilseeds, sugarcane, tobacco, etc., were more remunerative than food grains. Again, the cultivation of crops like condiments, spices, fruits and vegetables could cater to a wider market. The commercialization trend reached the highest level of development in the plantation sector, i.e., in tea, coffee, rubber, indigo, etc., which was mostly owned by Europeans, and the produce was for sale in a wider market. 7. Destruction of industry and late development of modern industry. Indian industry was steadily destroyed. The destruction of textile competition of India is a glaring example of the deindustrialization of India. A thriving shipbuilding industry was crushed. Surat and Malabar on the western coast and Bengal and Masulipatam on the eastern coast were known for their shipbuilding industries. Indian traders, moneylenders and bankers had amassed some wealth as junior partners of English merchant capitalists in India. Their role fitted in the British scheme of colonial exploitation. The Indian moneylender provided loans to hard-pressed agriculturists and thus facilitated the state collection of revenue. The first cotton textile mill was set up in 1853 in Bombay by Kawaji Nanabhoy, and the first jute mill came up in 1855 in Risra, Bengal. The industrial development was characterized by a lopsided pattern. Core and heavy industries and power generation were neglected, and some regions were favored more than the others, causing regional disparities. 8. Nationalist critique of colonial economy. Dadabhai Naoroji, the grand old man of India, who after a brilliant analysis of the colonial economy put forward the theory of economic drain in poverty and un-British rule in India. The essence of 19th-century colonialism, they said, lay in the transformation of India into a supplier of foodstuffs and raw materials to the metropolis, a market for metropolitan manufacturers and a field for investment of British capital. British policies making India poor. The problem of poverty was seen as a problem of raising productive capacity and energy of the people, or as a problem of national development, thus making poverty a national issue. Growth of trade and railways. To help Britain, the development of railways, they argued, was not coordinated with India's industrial needs, and it ushered in a commercial rather than an industrial revolution. The net effect of the railways was to enable foreign goods to outsell indigenous products. One-way free trade and tariff policy. The nationalists claimed that one-way free trade was ruining Indian handicrafts industry, exposing it to premature, unequal and unfair competition. Effect of economic drain. According to nationalist estimates, the economic drain at that time was a. more than the total land revenue, or b. half the total government revenue, or c. 1/3 of the total savings. IX. Economic issue. A stimulant to national unrest. The nationalist agitation on economic issues served to undermine the ideological hegemony of alien rulers over Indian minds that the foreign rule was in the interest of Indians, thus exposing the myth of its moral foundations. X. Stages of colonialism in India. First stage. www.desirous.com. Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com. Spectrum short notes. 135. The period of merchant capital, mercantilism, often described as the period of monopoly trade and direct appropriation, or the period of East India Company's domination, 1757–1813, was based on two basic objectives: I. To acquire a monopoly of trade with India, against other English or European merchants or trading companies as well as against the Indian merchants, e. To directly appropriate or take over governmental revenues through control over state power. B. The only changes made were I. In military organization and technology which native rulers were also introducing in their armed forces, and e. In administration at the top of the structure of revenue collection so that it could become more efficient and smooth. C. In this phase there was large-scale drain of wealth from India which constituted 2 to 3% of Britain's national income at the time. Second stage. Owing to its mode of exploitation being trade, this stage is also termed as colonialism of free trade. In this phase the following dominant features were visible. A. India's colonial economy was integrated with the British and world capitalist economy. B. Free entry was also granted to the British capitalists to develop tea, coffee and indigo plantations, trade, transport, mining and modern industries in India. C. The permanent settlement and the ryotwary system in agriculture were introduced to transform traditional agrarian structure into a capitalist one. D. Administration was made more comprehensive and included villages and outlying areas of the country. E. Personal law was largely left untouched since it did not affect colonial transformation of the economy. F. Modern education was introduced to provide cheap manpower to the vastly expanded administration. It was also aimed at transforming India's society and culture for two reasons: a. Create an overall atmosphere of change and development, and b. Give birth to a culture of loyalty to the rulers. G. The taxation and the burden on peasant rose sharply due to economic transformation and costly administration, civil as well as military. H. India absorbed 10 to 12% of British exports and nearly 20% of Britain's textile exports. I. Indian Army was used for British expansion of colonialism in Asia and Africa. Third stage. The third stage is often described as the era of foreign investments and international competition for colonies. These changes were as follows. A. Britain's industrial supremacy was challenged by several countries of Europe, the United States and Japan. B. As a result of the application of scientific knowledge to industry, the pace of industrialization increased sharply. The British thus tried to justify their rule over Indians for centuries to come, all in the name of civilizing a barbaric people, the white man's burden. Space for your notes. www.desirous.com. Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com. Spectrum short notes. 136. Telegram link, https://t.me/desirous. Chapter 29 Development of Indian Press. Short notes, prelims plus mains, www.desirous.com. James Augustus Hickey in 1780 started the Bengal Gazette or Calcutta General Advertiser, the first newspaper in India, which was seized in 1872. More newspapers, journals came up: the Bengal Journal, the Calcutta Chronicle, the Madras Courier, the Bombay Herald. Early regulations. A. Censorship of Press Act, 1799. Lord Wellesley enacted this, anticipating French invasion of India. It imposed almost wartime press restrictions including pre-censorship. B. Licensing regulations, 1823. The acting Governor-General, John Adams, who had reactionary views, enacted these. According to these regulations, starting or using a press without license was a penal offense. Rammohan Roy's Mirat ul Akbar had to stop publication. C. Press Act of 1835 or Metcalfe Act. Metcalfe, Governor-General, 1835-36, repealed the obnoxious 1823 ordinance. The new Press Act, 1835, required a printer, publisher to give a precise account of premises of a publication. D. Licensing Act, 1857. Due to the emergency caused by the 1857 revolt, this act imposed licensing restrictions. E. Registration Act, 1867. This replaced Metcalfe's Act of 1835 and was of a regulatory, not restrictive, nature. As per the Act, every book, newspaper was required to print the name of the printer and the publisher and the place of the publication, and a copy was to be submitted to the local government within 1 month of the publication of a book. Struggle by early nationalists to secure press freedom. Raja Rammohan Roy had protested against a resolution restricting the freedom of the press. The Hindu and Swadesamitran, G. Subramania Iyer. www.desirous.com. Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com. Spectrum Short Notes. 137. The Bengali Surendranath Banerjee. Voice of India. Dadabhai Nauroji. Amrita Bazar. Patrika Sisir Kumar Ghosh and Motilal Ghosh, Indian Mirror. NN. Sen. Kesari, in Marathi, and Maharatha, in English, Balgangadhar Tilak, Sudarak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Hindustan and Advocate, G.P. Verma. Tribune and Akhbar. I am in Punjab, Gujarati, Indu Prakash, Gyan Prakash and Kal in Bombay. Som Prakash, Banganivasi and Sadarani in Bengal. Vernacular Press Act, 1878. The Vernacular Press Act, VPA, was designed to better control the vernacular press and effectively punish and repress seditious writing. The provisions of the Act included the following. The district magistrate was empowered to call upon the printer and publisher of any vernacular newspaper to enter into a bond with the government, undertaking not to cause disaffection against the government or antipathy between persons of different religions, caste, race through published material. The printer and publisher could also be required to deposit security which could be forfeited if the regulation were contravened, and press equipment could be seized if the offense reoccurred. The magistrate's action was final and no appeal could be made in a court of law. A vernacular newspaper could get exemption from the operation of the Act by submitting proofs to a government censor. B. The Act came to be nicknamed the Gagging Act. The worst features of this Act were I. Discrimination between English and vernacular press, e. No right of appeal. C. In 1883, Surendranath Banerjee became the first Indian journalist to be imprisoned. D. Newspaper, Incitement to Offences, Act, 1908 aimed against extremist nationalist activity. The Act empowered the magistrates to confiscate press property which published objectionable material likely to cause incitement to murder, acts of violence. E. Indian Press Act, 1910. This Act revived the worst features of the VPA. Local government was empowered to demand a security at registration from the printer, publisher and forfeit, deregister if it was an offending newspaper, and the printer of a newspaper was required to submit 2 copies of each issue to local government free of charge. During and after the First World War. In 1921, on the recommendations of a press committee chaired by Tej Bahadur Sapru, the Press Acts of 1908 and 1910 were repealed. B. Indian Press, Emergency Powers, Act, 1931. This Act gave sweeping powers to provincial governments to suppress propaganda for civil disobedience movement. During the Second World War, under the Defence of India rules, pre-censorship was imposed and amendments made in Press Emergency Act and Official Secrets Act. Space for your notes. www.desirous.com. Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com. Spectrum Short Notes. 138. Chapter 30 Development of Education. I. Under company rule short notes, prelims plus mains. Calcutta Madrasa was established by Warren Hastings in 1781 for the study of Muslim law and related subjects. Sanskrit College was established by Jonathan Duncan, the resident, at Benares in 1791 for study of Hindu law and philosophy. Fort William College was set up by Wellesley in 1800 for training of civil servants of the company in languages and customs of Indians, closed in 1802. A humble beginning by Charter Act of 1813. Efforts of enlightened Indians such as Raja Rammohan Roy bore fruit, and a grant was sanctioned for Calcutta College, set up in 1817 by educated Bengalis, imparting English education in Western humanities and sciences. The government also set up 3 Sanskrit colleges at Calcutta, Delhi and Agra. Orientalist-Anglicist controversy. Within the General Committee on Public Instruction, the Anglicists argued that the government spending on education should be exclusively for modern studies. The Orientalists said while Western sciences and literature should be taught to prepare students to take up jobs, emphasis should be placed on expansion of traditional Indian learning. British planned to educate a small section of upper and middle classes, thus creating a class, Indian in blood and colour but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals and in intellect, who would act as interpreters between the government and masses and would enrich the vernaculars by which knowledge of Western sciences and literature would reach the masses. This was called the downward filtration theory. Efforts of Thomson James Thomson, Lieutenant Governor of N.W. Provinces, 1843-53, developed a comprehensive scheme of village education through the medium of vernacular languages. Wood's Dispatch, 1854. www.desiraeus.com. Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com. Spectrum short notes. 139. It asked the government of India to assume responsibility for education of the masses, thus repudiating the downward filtration theory, at least on paper. It systematized the hierarchy from vernacular primary schools in villages at bottom, followed by Anglo-vernacular high schools and an affiliated college at the district level, and affiliating universities in the presidency towns of Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. It recommended English as the medium of instruction for higher studies and vernaculars at school level. It laid stress on female and vocational education, and on teachers' training. It laid down that the education imparted in government institutions should be secular. It recommended a system of grants in aid to encourage private enterprise. Developments in 1857, universities at Calcutta, Bombay and Madras were set up, and later, departments of education were set up in all provinces. The Bethune School, founded by J.E.D. Bethune at Calcutta, 1849, was the first fruit of a powerful movement for education of women which arose in 1840s and 1850s. 2. After the Crown took over. Hunter Education Commission, 1882-83, the Commission emphasized that state special care is required for extension and improvement of primary education, and that primary education should be imparted through vernacular. Recommended transfer of control of primary education to newly set up district and municipal boards. Recommended that secondary, high school, education should have 2 divisions, literary, leading up to university. Vocational, for commercial careers. Drew attention to inadequate facilities for female education, especially outside presidency towns, and made recommendations for its spread. More teaching-cum-examining universities were set up, like the Punjab University, 1882, and the Allahabad University, 1887. Indian Universities Act, 1904 and 1902, Raleigh Commission was set up to go into conditions and prospects of universities in India and to suggest measures for improvement in their constitution and working. Based on its recommendations, the Indian Universities Act was passed in 1904. As per the Act, A. Universities were to give more attention to study and research. B. Number of fellows of a university and their period in office were reduced and most fellows were to be nominated by the government. C. Government was to have powers to veto universities' Senate regulations and could amend these regulations or pass regulations on its own. D. Conditions were to be made stricter for affiliation of private colleges, and E. 5 lakh rupees were to be sanctioned per annum for 5 years for improvement of higher education and universities. Government Resolution on Education Policy, 1913. In 1906, the Progressive State of Baroda introduced compulsory primary education throughout its territories. In its 1913 Resolution on Education Policy, the government refused to take up the responsibility of compulsory education, but accepted the policy of removal of illiteracy and urged provincial governments to take early steps to provide free elementary education to the poorer and more backward sections. Sadler University Commission, 1917–19, the commission was set up to study and report on problems of Calcutta University, but its recommendations were applicable more or less to other universities also. Its observations were as follows. A school course should cover 12 years. Students should enter university after an intermediate stage, rather than matric, for a 3-year degree course in university. This was done to www.desireus.com mailid, caredesireus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. Prepare students for university stage. Relieve universities of a large number of below university standard students, and provide collegiate education to those not planning to go through university stage. B. There should be less rigidity in framing university regulations. 140. C. A university should function as centralized, unitary residential teaching autonomous body, rather than as scattered, affiliated colleges. D. Female education, applied scientific and technological education, teachers training including those for professional and vocational colleges should be extended. Education under Diachi under Montagu-Chelmsford reforms education was shifted to provincial. Ministries and the government stopped taking direct interest in educational matters. Hartog Committee, 1929, its main recommendations were as follows. A. Emphasis should be given to primary education, but there need be no hasty expansion or compulsion in education. B. Only deserving students should go in for high school and intermediate stage, while average students should be diverted to vocational courses after 8th standard. C. For improvements in standards of university education, admissions should be restricted. Sargent Plan of Education. The Sargent Plan, Sargent was the educational advisor to the government, was worked out by the Central Advisory Board of Education in 1944. It recommended a. Pre-primary education for 3 to 6 years age group, free, universal and compulsory elementary education for 6 to 11 years age group, high school education for 11 to 17 years age group for selected children, and a university course of 3 years after higher secondary. High schools to be of 2 types, I. Academic and E. Technical and vocational. B. Adequate technical, commercial and arts education. C. Abolition of intermediate course. D. Liquidation of adult illiteracy in 20 years. E. Stress on teachers' training, physical education, education for the physically and mentally handicapped. 3. Development of vernacular education. 1835, 1836, 1838, William Adams' reports on vernacular education in Bengal and Bihar pointed out defects in the system of vernacular education. 1843–53, James Jonathan's experiments in Northwest provinces, UP, included opening one government school as model school in each tehsildari and a normal school for teachers training for vernacular schools. 1853, in a famous minute, Lord Dalhousie expressed strong opinion in favor of vernacular education. 1854, Wood's dispatch made the following provisions for vernacular education. A. Improvement of standards. B. Supervision by government agency. C. Normal schools to train teachers. 1854-71, the government paid some attention to secondary and vernacular education. The number of vernacular schools increased by more than five-fold. 1882, the Hunter Commission held that states should make special efforts for extension and improvement of vernacular education. Mass education was to be seen as instructing masses through vernaculars. 1904, education policy put special emphasis on vernacular education and increased grants for it. 1929, Hartog Committee presented a gloomy picture of primary education. 1937, these schools received encouragement from Congress ministries. IV. Development of Technical Education. Engineering College at Roorkee was set up in 1847, Calcutta College of Engineering came up in 1856. www.desiraeus.com. Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com. Spectrum short notes. V. Evaluation of British policy on education. 141. Even the inadequate measures the government took for the expansion of modern education were guided by concerns other than philanthropic. The government measures for promotion of education were influenced by a. Agitation in favor of modern education by enlightened Indians, Christian missionaries and humanitarian officials. B. Need to ensure a cheap supply of educated Indians to man an increasing number of subordinate posts in administration and in British business concerns. C. Hope that educated Indians would help expand market for British manufactures in India. D. An expectation that Western education would reconcile Indians to British rule, particularly as it glorified British conquerors and their administration. Traditional system of Indian learning gradually declined for want of support. Mass education was neglected, leading to widespread illiteracy, 1911, 84%, and in 1921, 92%, which created a wide linguistic and cultural gulf between the educated few and the masses. Since education was to be paid for, it became a monopoly of upper and richer classes and city dwellers. There was an almost total neglect of women's education because, the government did not want to arouse wrath of orthodox sections, and it had no immediate utility for the colonial rule. Scientific and technical education was by and large neglected. Chapter 31, Peasant Movements 1857–1947. Peasantry. Under colonialism, peasants suffered from high rents, illegal levies, arbitrary evictions and unpaid labor in zamindari areas. In Rayatwari areas, the government itself levied heavy land revenue. 2. A survey of early peasant movements. Indigo Revolt, 1859–60, anger of the peasants exploded in 1859 when, led by Digambar Biswas and Bishnu Biswas of Nadia district, they decided not to grow indigo under duress and resisted the physical pressure of the planters and their lathials, retainers, backed by police and the courts. Government appointed an indigo commission to inquire into the problem of indigo cultivation. Pabna Agrarian Leagues. Large parts of eastern Bengal witnessed agrarian unrest caused by oppressive practices of the zamindars. Zamindars resorted to enhanced rents beyond legal limits and prevented the tenants from acquiring occupancy rights under Act 10 of 1859. Deccan riots. Riots of Deccan region of western India suffered heavy taxation under the Rayatwari system. The conditions had worsened due to a crash in cotton prices after the end of the American Civil War in 1864, the government's decision to raise the land revenue by 50% in 1867, and a succession of bad harvests. 3. Changed nature of peasant movements after 1857. Peasants emerged as the main force in agrarian movements, fighting directly for their own demands. Demands were centered almost wholly on economic issues. Movements were directed against the immediate enemies of the peasant, foreign planters and indigenous zamindars and moneylenders. Struggles were directed towards specific and limited objectives and redressal of particular grievances. Colonialism was not the target of these movements. It was not the objective of these movements to end the system of subordination or exploitation of the peasants. Territorial reach was limited. There was no continuity of struggle or long-term organization. www.desireus.com Mailid, caredesireus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 142. Peasants developed a strong awareness of their legal rights and asserted them in and outside the courts. IV. Weaknesses. A lack of an adequate understanding of colonialism. 19th-century peasants did not possess a new ideology and a new social, economic and political program. These struggles, however militant, occurred within the framework of the old societal order lacking a positive conception of an alternative society v. Later movements. The Kisan Sabha movement was set up in 1918 by Gauri Shankar Mishra and Indra Narayan Dwivedi. Districts of Rai Bareli, Faizabad and Sultanpur. Movement declined soon, partly due to government repression and partly because of the passing of the Awadh Rent Amendment Act. Ekka movement. Issues involved were I. High rents, 50% higher than the recorded rates, E. Oppression of thikadars in charge of revenue collection, and E. Practice of share rents. B. Meetings of the Ekka or the Unity movement involved a symbolic religious ritual in which the assembled peasants vowed that they would pay only the recorded rent but would pay it on time, not leave when evicted, refuse to do forced labor, give no help to criminals, abide by panchayat decisions. Mapilla revolt. Mapillas were the Muslim tenants inhabiting the Malabar region. The communalization of the rebellion completed the isolation of the Mapillas from the Khilafat non-cooperation movement. By December 1921, all resistance had come to a stop. Bardoli Satyagraha. Bardoli Taluka in Surat district had witnessed intense politicization after the coming of Gandhi on the national political scene. Movement sparked off in January 1926 when the authorities decided to increase the land revenue by 30%. Women of Bardoli Gavavalabhbhai Patel's title of Sada. In February 1926, Vallabhbhai Patel was called to lead the movement. The All India Kisan Congress, Sabha. This Sabha was founded in Lucknow in April 1936 with Swami Sajanand Saraswati as the president and N.G. Ranga as the general secretary. Under Congress ministries, the period 1937-39 was the high watermark of the peasant movements and activity under the Congress provincial rule. Vi. Peasant activity in provinces. Kerala. One significant campaign by the peasants was in 1938 for the amendment of the Malabar Tenancy Act, 1929. Andhra. This region had already witnessed a decline in the prestige of zamindars after the defeat by congressmen in elections. Anti-zamindar movements were going on in some places. Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha developed a rift with the Congress over the Bakisht land issue because of an unfavorable government resolution which was not acceptable to the Sabha. The movement died out by August 1939. Punjab. A new direction to the movement was given by the Punjab Kisan Committee in 1937. The main targets of the movement were the landlords of Western Punjab who dominated the Unionist ministry. www.desireus.com Mailid, caredesireus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 143. Peasant activity was also organized in Bengal, Burdwan and 24 Parganas, Assam, Surma Valley, Orissa, Central Provinces and NWFP. During the war, because of a pro-war line adopted by the Communists, the AIKS was split on Communist and non-Communist lines post-war phase. Tebaga movement. Storm center of the movement was North Bengal, principally among Rajbanshis, a low caste of tribal origin. Muslims also participated in large numbers. B. Telangana movement. This was the biggest peasant guerrilla war of modern Indian history, affecting 3,000 villages and 3 million population. The Telangana movement had many positive achievements to its credit. In the villages controlled by guerrillas, Vethi and forced labor disappeared. Agricultural wages were raised. Illegally seized lands were restored. Steps were taken to fix ceilings and redistribute lands. Measures were taken to improve irrigation and fight cholera. An improvement in the condition of women was witnessed. 7. The autocratic feudal regime of India's biggest princely state was shaken up, clearing the way for the formation of Andhra Pradesh on linguistic lines. 8. Balance sheet of peasant movements. These movements created an atmosphere for post-independence agrarian reforms. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 144. www.desiraeus.com Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. Chapter 33 Challenges before the Newborn Nation. Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains, I. First Day of Independent India. 145. On August 15, 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru, as Prime Minister of India, hoisted the Indian national flag above the Lahori Gate of Red Fort in Delhi. First cabinet after independence. Independent India, however, had to face several challenges. Immediate challenges, medium-term challenges and long-term challenges. Independence Act had laid the procedure for the resolution of three major problems, i. the settlement of boundaries between the two nations, e. the division of apparatus and personnel of Indian civil services and some other services, e. division of military assets and formations. 2. Radcliffe's boundary award and the communal riots. West Punjab, which went to Pakistan, received 62,000 square miles of territory and 15.7 million people, census 1941, of whom 11.85 million were Muslims. Numbers not important, just analysis. Number yourself only. East Punjab, India's share, received 37,000 square miles of land area, with a population of 12.6 million, of whom 4.37 million were Muslims. West Bengal became part of India with a territory of 28,000 square miles, and a population of 21.2 million, of whom 5.3 million were Muslims. East Bengal, which constituted East Pakistan, got 49,400 square miles of territory and 39.10 million people. Challenges before the Boundary Commission. Boundary Commission consisted of 2 Muslims and 2 non-Muslim judges in each case, and worked under serious constraints. Regions most affected by riots. Regions through which the Radcliffe line was drawn became most violent, and maximum number of murders, rapes and abduction of women and children took place. 3. Challenges associated with division of resources. Division of civil government. To resolve the division of civil government amicably, a partition council, presided over by the Governor-General and consisting of 2 representatives each of India and Pakistan, was set up. All civil servants were offered to give their option about the dominion they wanted to serve. Division of finances. Pakistan wanted a 1/4 share of the total cash balances, but India had to point out that only a small portion of the cash balances represented the real cash needs of the undivided India, and the rest was maintained only as an anti-inflationary mechanism. Division of defense personnel and equipment. For a smooth division of the armed forces and their plants, machinery, equipment and stores, a joint defense council, headed by Auchinleck as its supreme commander, was set up. The British troops started to leave India from August 17, 1947, and the process was completed by February 1948. IV. Assassination of Gandhi on the evening of January 30, 1948, as he carried on his usual prayer meeting at Birla Mansion, New Delhi, Mahatma Gandhi was shot dead by Nathuram Godse. Communalism and misinterpretation of nationalism were two fundamental factors under whose influence Godse killed Gandhi. The rehabilitation and resettlement of refugees. People displaced by partition were refugees, in the sense that they had not left their homes voluntarily. Indian government established an emergency committee of the cabinet to deal with the crisis in Delhi, and a Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation to look after the refugees. www.desireyus.com Mailid, caredesireyus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 146. East Punjab for urban refugees. The government started industrial and vocational training schemes, and even grants were given to start small businesses or industries. Rural refugees were given land, agricultural loans and housing subsidies. Bengal problem was much more prolonged and complicated in Bengal. Delhi Pact on Minorities to resolve the problems of refugees and restore communal peace in the two countries, especially in Bengal, East Pakistan as well as West Bengal. The Indian Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the Pakistani Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, signed an agreement on April 8, 1950. The agreement, known as the Delhi Pact on Minorities or Liaquat-Nehru Pact, envisaged the appointment of ministers from minority communities in both Pakistan and India at both central and provincial levels. Under the pact, minority commissions were to be set up, together with the commissions of inquiry to look into the probable causes behind the communal riots on both sides of border. Centers of refugee settlements in India in Delhi, Lajpat Nagar, Rajinder Nagar, All Coaching Wala Shop here, Punjabi Bagh, Nizamuddin East and Kingsway Camp were some areas developed into housing complexes to settle the refugees permanently. Communists and independents. In December 1947, the Communist Party of India, CPI, had denounced the Indian independence as fake. The communist insurgency spread to other parts of India, especially in West Bengal, which saw the revival of the Tebaga movement and an urban insurgency in Calcutta. Why communists were skeptical about independence. They believed that a policy of class struggle and armed insurgency against the state run by the Congress, alleged as collaborationist bourgeoisie, was necessary to shift the attention of the masses from the politics of communal hatred that shrouded the country after partition. Late 1940s and the early 1950s witnessed communist successes in Asian countries like China, Malaya, Indonesia, the Philippines and Burma, Myanmar. According to Ramachandra Guha, the CPI leadership, encouraged by the initial successes of the Telangana movement, misconceived the scattered disillusionment with the Congress's revolutionary potential, and thought this as the beginning of Red India. Shift from antagonistic strategy to constitutional democracy. Communist movement remained localized in Hyderabad and West Bengal. The government also decided to take stern action. While in the Hyderabad region the Indian Armed Forces continued its police action, in West Bengal the CPI was banned in March 1948, and in January, a Security Act was passed to imprison the communist leaders without trial. Decided to withdraw the Telangana movement and forge an inclusive front of the peasants, workers and middle classes. Space for your notes. www.desireyus.com Mailid, caredesireyus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 147. Chapter 34 The Indian States Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains, I. The company's struggle for equality from a position of subordination, 1740–1765, starting with Anglo-French rivalry with the coming of Duplex in 1751, East India Company asserted political identity with capture of Arcot, 1751. With Battle of Plassey in 1757, East India Company acquired political power next only to the Bengal Nawabs. In 1765, with the acquisition of the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, the East India Company became a significant political power. 2. Policy of ring fence, 1765–1813. This policy was reflected in Warren Hastings' wars against the Marathas and Mysore. Wellesley's policy of subsidiary alliance was an extension of ring fence, which sought to reduce states to a position of dependence on British government in India. 3. Policy of subordinate isolation, 1813–1857. States surrendered all forms of external sovereignty but retained sovereignty in internal administration. British residents were transformed from diplomatic agents of a foreign power to executive and controlling offices of a superior government. This policy of annexation culminated in usurpation of 8 states by Dalhousie IV. Policy of subordinate union, 1857–1935. Year 1858 saw the assumption of direct responsibility by the Crown. After 1858, the fiction of authority of the Mughal emperor ended. Sanction for all matters of succession was required from the Crown, since the Crown stood forth as the unquestioned ruler and the paramount power. Curzon's approach. Curzon stretched the interpretation of old treaties to mean that the princes, in their capacity as servants of people, were supposed to work side by side with the Governor-General in the scheme of Indian government. Post 1905. According to the recommendations of the Montfort Reforms, 1921, a Chamber of Princes, Narendra Mandal, was set up as a consultative and advisory body having no say in the internal affairs of individual states and having no powers to discuss matters for the purpose of the Chamber. The Indian states were divided into 3 categories. 1. Directly represented, 109. 2. Represented through representatives, 127. 3. Recognized as feudal holdings or jagars. Butler Committee. Butler Committee, 1927, was set up to examine the nature of relationship between the princely states and government. It gave the following recommendations. 1. Paramountcy must remain supreme and must fulfill its obligations, adopting and defining itself according to the shifting necessities of time and progressive development of states. 2. States should not be handed over to an Indian government in British India, responsible to an Indian legislature, without the consent of states. The Policy of Equal Federation, 1935–1947, a non-starter. The Government of India Act, 1935 proposed a federal assembly with 125 out of 375 seats for the princes and the Council of States with 104 out of 160 seats for the princes. Vi. Integration and merger. After World War II began and a position of non-cooperation was adopted by the Congress, the British government tried to break the deadlock through the Cripps Mission, 1942, Wavell Plan. 1945, Cabinet Mission, 1946, and Attlee's Statement, February 1947. www.desiraeus.com. Mailid, caredesiraeus@gmail.com. Spectrum Short Notes. 148. Sardar Patel, who was in charge of the States Ministry in the interim cabinet, helped by V.P. Menon, the secretary in the ministry, appealed to the patriotic feeling of rulers to join the Indian Dominion in matters of defense, communication and external affairs. By August 15, 1947, 136 states had joined the Indian Union but others remained precariously outside. Plebiscite and army action. Junagadh Muslim Nawab wanted to join Pakistan but a Hindu majority population wanted to join the Indian Union. Hyderabad wanted a sovereign status. It signed a standstill agreement with India. In November 1947, Kashmir state of Jammu and Kashmir had a Hindu prince and a Muslim majority population. Prince envisaged a sovereign status for the state and was reluctant to accede to either of the dominions. Special status of Jammu and Kashmir was recognized under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which implied a limited jurisdiction of the Indian Union over the state as compared to other states. Gradual integration problem now was twofold. I. Of transforming the states into viable administrative units, e. Of absorbing them into the constitutional units. This was sought to be solved by 1. Incorporating smaller states, 216 such states, into contiguous provinces and listed in Part A. For instance, 39 states of Orissa and Chhattisgarh were incorporated into central provinces, Orissa. Gujarat states were incorporated into Bombay. 2. Making some states as centrally administered for strategic or special reasons, listed in Part C, 61 states, Himachal Pradesh, Vindhya Pradesh, Manipur, Tripura, Bhopal, etc. 3. Creating 5 unions, United States of Kathiawar, United States of Matsya, Patiala and East Punjab States Union, Rajasthan, and United States of Travancore Kochi, later Kerala. Space for your notes. www.desireus.com Mail id, caredesireus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes. Chapter 35 Making of the Constitution for India Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains, www.desireus.com. 149. Indian Constitution, which came into effect on January 26, 1950, has the distinction of being the longest in the world in terms of its length, content and complexity owing to country's size and diversity. Background. Constitution of India was framed between December 1946 and December 1949. Its roots deep lie in the Indian national movement against the colonial rule as well as in the movements for responsible and constitutional government in the princely states. In the modern sense, there appeared the Constitution of India Bill, also known as the Home Rule Bill in 1895, which envisaged basic human rights. The bill had its first reading in the House of Commons in December 1925. After the non-cooperation movement, Motilal Nehru in February 1924 introduced in the Central Legislative Assembly a resolution that gave due regard to minority rights and interests and came to be known as the National Demand. Nehru Report, submitted on August 1928, was an outline of a draft constitution for India. The idea that India's constitution should be framed via a constituent assembly elected for this very purpose and based on widest possible franchise gained support. Although M.N. Roy had made such a suggestion earlier, Jawaharlal Nehru was the first national leader to enunciate the idea in 1933. In September 1945, the newly elected Labour government in England announced that it planned to create a constituent assembly in India. On March 15, 1946, the Cabinet Mission came to India and, in the course of its stay, recommended the forming of a. the Constituent Assembly, and b. an interim government. 2. Constituent Assembly. Formation. It was decided that the Constituent Assembly was to be elected indirectly by the provincial assemblies. They were to be elected by the representatives of each community in their respective legislative assemblies by the method of proportional representation with single transferable vote. Constituent Assembly opened on December 9, 1946 in the Constitution Hall, now the Central Hall of Parliament House at New Delhi. Jawaharlal Nehru moved the Historic Objectives Resolution on 13 December 1946. 2 Constituent Assemblies, India and Pakistan. On June 26, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the Governor-General, announced the setting up of a separate Constituent Assembly for Pakistan. Indian Independence Act, 1947, passed with surprising speed, came into force on July 18, 1947. Indian Independence Act, 1947 declared the Constituent Assembly of India to be a fully sovereign body, and on the midnight of August 14, 1947, the Assembly assumed full powers of the governance of the country. Evaluation of the Assembly for India. Constituent Assembly was indirectly elected by the provincial assemblies, which themselves were elected on the basis of a limited franchise established by the Government of India Act of 1935. After independence, now the work of Constituent Assembly was organized into 5 stages. First, committees were required to present reports on basic issues. www.desireus.com mailid, caredesireus@gmail.com Spectrum short notes. 150. Second, Benegal Narsingh Rao prepared an initial draft on the basis of the reports of these committees and on his own research into the constitutions of other countries. Third, the drafting committee, under the chairmanship of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, presented a detailed draft constitution which was published for public discussion and comments. Fourth, draft constitution was debated and amendments proposed. Fifth, Constitution of India was adopted. Work, committees and consensus. When the Constituent Assembly first met on December 9, 1946, J.B. Kripalani, the then Congress President, proposed the name of Dr. Sakhadanand Sinha, the oldest member of the Assembly, for the post of the Provisional President. Later, on December 11, Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the President of the Constituent Assembly. In the light of their comments and criticism, the drafting committee prepared a second draft which consisted of 315 articles and 9 schedules. This second draft was placed before the Constituent Assembly on February 21, 1948. The draft was then considered clause by the Assembly. The third reading commenced on November 14 and was finished on November 26, 1949. Preamble was adopted last. It had taken 2 years, 11 months and 18 days to complete the task. As many as 7,000 odd amendments had been proposed and nearly 2,500 were actually discussed before the draft constitution was accepted. On November 26, 1949, the people of India in the Constituent Assembly adopted, enacted and gave to themselves the Constitution of the Sovereign Democratic Republic of India. Dr. Rajendra Prasad as President of the Assembly signed the document. The members of the Constituent Assembly appended their signatures to it on January 24, 1950, the last day of the Assembly. In all, 284 members actually signed the Constitution. Constituent Assembly, besides drafting the Constitution of India, adopted the national flag on July 22, 1947, and adopted the national anthem and national song on January 24, 1950, the last day of its session. Space for your notes. www.desireus.com mailid, caredesireus@gmail.com Spectrum short notes. Chapter 36 The Evolution of Nationalist Foreign Policy Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains www.desireus.com. 151. At independence, India was a member of 51 international organizations and a signatory to 600-odd treaties. In the 1920s, it was a founding member of the League of Nations, the International Labour Organization, and the International Court of Justice. It participated in the Washington Conference on Naval Armaments in 1921–22. 1880 to First World War, anti-imperialism and pan-Asian feeling. British undertook a number of expansionist expeditions which were opposed by the nationalists. These expeditions included Second Afghan War, 1878–80. Dispatch of troops by England in 1882, to suppress the nationalist uprising by Col. Arabi in Egypt. Annexation of Burma in 1885. Invasion of Tibet under Curzon in 1903, and a number of annexations during the 1890s in the northwest to stop the Russian advance. The nationalists supported the tribal resistance to these adventures by the British. So, the emerging themes during 1880–1914 were solidarity with other colonies fighting for freedom, such as Russia, Ireland, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, Sudan, Burma and Afghanistan, pan-Asian feeling reflected in condemnation of annexation of Burma in 1885. Inspiration from Japan as an example of industrial development. Condemnation of the participation of Japan in the international suppression of the I-Ho-Tuan Uprising, 1895. IV. Condemnation of the imperialist efforts to divide China. V. Defeat of the Tsarist Russia by Japan, which exploded the myth of European superiority. Vi. Congress support for Burma's freedom. World War I. In 1925, the Congress condemned the dispatch of Indian Army to suppress the Chinese Nationalist Army under Sun Yat-Senator. 1920s and 1930s, identifying with socialists in 1927, Nehru attended the Congress of Oppressed Nationalists at Brussels on behalf of the Indian National Congress. After 1936, anti-fascism in 1939, at the Tripuri session, the Congress dissociated itself from the British policy which supported fascism in Europe. After independence, Nehru is often called the architect of independent India's foreign policy. In his address to the Constituent Assembly on December 4, 1947, Nehru laid the foundations of India's foreign policy. The main challenge to Nehru was to evolve a policy that could help India compete on the world arena with the modern states, and for that, he realized, a drastic socio-economic and technological transformation of the country was required. His objective was to transform India without becoming dependent on any particular country or group of countries to the extent of losing independence of thought or policy. D. Panchsheel and non-alignment. Panchsheel and non-alignment are the foundations of India's foreign policy. www.desirous.com. Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com. Spectrum Short Notes. 152. Panchsheel. It was on April 29, 1954, that Panchsheel, or the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, were first formally enunciated in the Agreement on Trade and Intercourse between the Tibet region of China and India. The two governments had resolved to enter into the agreement on the basis of 5 principles, namely: I. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, e. Mutual non-aggression, e. Mutual non-interference, IV. Equality and mutual benefit, v. Peaceful coexistence. Panchsheel was incorporated into the 10 Principles of International Peace and Cooperation put forward in the declaration issued by the April 1955 Bandung Conference of 29 Afro-Asian countries. And in 1961, the Conference of Non-Aligned Nations in Belgrade accepted Panchsheel as the basic principles at the center of the non-aligned movement. Non-alignment term, non-alignment, got currency in the post-Bandung Conference. 1955. In the Conference of Non-Aligned Powers, the first non-aligned movement or NAM summit, held in Belgrade in 1961 and attended by 36 Mediterranean and Afro-Asian powers, Jawaharlal Nehru explained the essence of non-alignment. Non-alignment is the characteristic feature of India's foreign policy. India was one of the founder members of NAM. Non-alignment is one of the principles of India's foreign policy attempts to promote international peace, disarmament and territorial independence. It aims at democratization of international relations by putting an end to imperialism and hegemony and establishing a just and equal world order. Space for your notes. www.desirous.com. Mailid, caredesirous@gmail.com. Spectrum Short Notes. 153. Chapter 37 First General Elections Short Notes, Prelims plus Mains. www.desirous.com. Provisions of the Constitution relating to citizenship and Article 324, the Election Commission, were brought into force on November 26, 1949, while the rest of the Constitution came into force on January 26, 1950. Groundwork for the elections. The Election Commission Office of the Election Commission had been set up in a small way on January 25, 1950. The first Chief Election Commissioner of India was Sukumar Sen, an ICS officer, who assumed office on March 21, 1950. C. The Election Commission of India is a permanent constitutional body, established in accordance with the Constitution. Under Article 324, the Election Commission of India has been vested with the power of the superintendence, direction and control of the entire process for conduct of elections. D. Legislation for polls. First of the measures was the Representation of the People Act, 1950, which provided for the qualifications of voters and matters connected with the preparation and publication of electoral rolls. The second legislation was the Representation of the People Act, 1951, which laid down other provisions. Independent India goes to the polls for the first time. The elections were held based on universal adult franchise, with all those 21 years of age or older having the right to vote. B. Challenges. Many eligible voters could not be included in the electoral rolls despite much effort on the part of the Election Commission because of I. Ignorance and apathy of the common voter. E. Lack of adequate organization and experience on the part of the political parties, and E. Inexperience and poor organization of the governmental machinery in some of the states. Parties in the fray for the Lok Sabha. There were 53 political parties participating in the first general elections for the Lok Sabha seats. These included the 14 national parties, according to the report by the Election Commission of India. Besides, there were the independents. Conduct of elections. In the first general elections of the nation, there were 3 types of constituencies. Indelible ink was introduced as a precautionary step. A mark was put on the voter's finger as she went in to vote so as to prevent impersonation. The first past the post system was the mode, so of the many candidates, whoever got the plurality or the largest number of votes would be elected. Results. Lok Sabha. The Indian National Congress contested 472 seats and won 364, a stupendous majority of the seats to the Lok Sabha. State legislatures. In the state legislature elections, too, the Indian National Congress swept the polls. Space for your notes. www.desireyes.com. Mail id. caredesireyes@gmail.com. Spectrum short notes. Chapter 38. Developments under Nehru's leadership, 1947-64, short notes, prelims plus mains. www.desireyes.com. 154. I. Political developments. Debate over national language. The Language Committee of Constituent Assembly decided that the Hindi in Devanagari script was to be the official language, but transition to Hindi would be gradual. The language issue was further clarified by Parliament in 1963 through the Official Languages Act, which stated that Hindi was to become the official language in India from 1965. B. Linguistic reorganization of the states. The Congress in its 1920s session in Nagpur had made efforts to recognize regional linguistic identities and divided India into 21 linguistic units for its organizational setup. In December 1948, to pacify the vocal votaries of linguistic states, the Congress appointed a committee, JVP, with Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel and Pattabhi Sitaramaiah as its members. Its report, which is known as the JVP report, also went against the creation of linguistic states in the interests of national unity. The government conceded the demand for a separate state of Andhra, which finally came into existence on October 1, 1953, with the region being separated from the Tamil-speaking Madras state. In November 1956, the States Reorganization Act was passed, which provided for 14 states and 6 centrally administered territories. C. Growth of other political parties. The Socialist Party formed in 1934 as Congress Socialist Party, SP, with its own constitution, membership, discipline and ideology. It remained within the Congress Party till March 1948. In September 1952, the CSP merged with the Kisan Mazdoor Praja Party, KMPP, to form a new party, Praja Socialist Party, PSP. Praja Socialist Party. In September 1952, the Socialist Party and the KMPP merged to form Praja Socialist Party, PSP, with J.B. Kripalani as the chairman and Ashoka Mehta as the general secretary. Rammanohar Lohia's approach. Lohia believed in a position of equidistance from both the Congress and the Communists, and supported the organization of militant mass movements. The Communist Party. The official stand taken by the Communist Party of India towards the changing socio-political dynamics went through alterations. It first accepted India's independent foreign policy, though it still considered the government to be an agent of imperialism. Split in CPI in 1964, the party got divided into CPI, representing the earlier right and centrist trends, and CPM, or the Communist Party, Marxist, representing the earlier left trend. Bharatiya Jansangh. The Bharatiya Jansangh, founded on October 21, 1951, was based on right-wing ideology. The Swatantra Party. Founded in August 1959, the Swatantra Party was a non-socialist, constitutionalist and secular conservative party. The social base of the party was narrow and consisted of a section of industrialists and business class, discontented with government control, quotas and licenses and fearful of nationalization; landlords, jagirdars and princes, annoyed due to loss of fiefdoms, social power and status, and deteriorating economic conditions; ex-landlord turned capitalist farmers and rich and middle peasants, who had welcomed the abolition of landlordism but were fearful of losing part of their land; and a few retired civil servants. Communal and regional parties. The Hindu Mahasabha, which was founded in 1915 at Haridwar by Madan Mohan Malaviya, gradually disappeared from the political scene after 1952 and lost its support base to the Bharatiya Jana Sangh. The Muslim League, owing to its www.desirayus.com mail id, caredesirayus@gmail.com Spectrum short notes. 155. Association with the demand for Pakistan lay dormant, and many of its leaders joined the Congress Party and other parties. Later, it revived in parts of Tamil Nadu and in Kerala and was to become coalition partners of the Congress, CPI and CPM in coming years. The Akali Dal gave way to Shiromani Akali Dal and remained limited to Punjab. The other regional parties came into prominence. An undemocratic trouble began with the introduction of the Education Bill, which was, in actuality, a progressive measure. Nehru, though he had little objection to the Education Bill, maintained a neutral front in public. In the end, he succumbed to pressure from within and outside his party and advised the dismissal of the EMS government and imposition of President's rule in Kerala in July 1959. A democratically elected government was thus, for the first time in independent India, dismissed under emergency powers. 2. Concept of planning for economic development. The Planning Commission, an extra-constitutional body, was set up in March 1950 by a simple resolution of the Government of India. The National Development Council, NDC, which was to give final approval to the plans, was established on August 6, 1952. The first five-year plan, 1951–1956, based on Harad Domar model, sought to get the nation's economy out of the cycle of poverty. It addressed, mainly, the agrarian sector, including investments in dams and irrigation. The second plan, drafted under the leadership of P.C. Mahalanobis, stressed on heavy industries. The third plan was not significantly different from the second. Under the guidance of Nehru, who believed in democratic socialism, India opted for a mixed economy, i.e., elements from the capitalist model and socialist model were taken and mixed together. 3. Progress of science and technology. To emphasize the value of science and scientific research, Nehru himself assumed the chairmanship of the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR. Some of the strides taken in this direction are given below. In January 1947, to promote self-sustaining, scientific and technological growth, the National Physical Laboratory, India's first national laboratory, was set up, which was followed by the setting up of a network of 17 national laboratories, focusing on different areas of research. In 1952, the first of the 5 Institutes of Technology, patterned after the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was set up at Kharagpur. The Atomic Energy Commission, headed by Homi J. Bhau, was set up in August 1948. Nehru personally encouraged Bhau to do his best. In 1954, the government created a separate Department of Atomic Energy with Homi Bhau as secretary. In August 1956, India's first nuclear reactor in Trombay, Asia's first also, became critical. In 1962, the Indian National Committee for Space Research, INCOSPAR, together with a rocket launching facility at Thumba, TERLS, was established. Steps were taken to increase India's capacity in production of defense equipment. A changeover to decimal coinage and a metric system of weights and measures, in line with international standards, was made in phases between 1955 and 1962. IV. Social developments. Developments in education. In 1951 only 16.6% of the total population was literate, and the percentage was much lower in rural areas. In 1949, the Indian University Education Commission, under the chairmanship of Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, was set up. On the recommendation of the Commission, the University Grants Commission, UGC, was set up in 1953, and University Grants Commission Act was passed in 1956. To assist and advise the central and state governments on academic matters related to school education, the National Council of www.desiraeus.com mailed, caredesiraeus@gmail.com. Spectrum Short Notes 156. Educational Research and Training, NCERT, was established in September 1961 as a literary, scientific and charitable society. B. Social change. Under Nehru in 1955, the government passed the Anti-Untouchability Law, making the practice of untouchability punishable and a cognizable offense. For women's equal rights in the society, the Hindu Code Bill was moved in Parliament in 1951. V. Foreign policy. The basic principles of India's foreign policy, during Nehruvian era, broadly revolved around the premises given below. A. Disapproval of participation in any military alliance either bilaterally or multilaterally. B. An independent foreign policy not tied to any of the two contending power blocs, though this was not a synonym for a neutral foreign policy. C. A policy of friendship with every country, whether of the American bloc or of the Soviet bloc. D. An active anti-colonial policy which supported decolonization in Asian, African, Latin American countries. E. Open support to the policy of anti-apartheid. F. Promotion of disarmament as the key to world peace. Vi. Relations with neighbors. A. India and Pakistan. Kashmir issue. Pakistan refused to accept Kashmir's accession to India on October 26, 1947. In response to the Pakistan-sponsored tribal attack, India, supported by the local population under Sheikh Abdullah, undertook a swift military action. But, unfortunately, before the task of rescuing the territory could be accomplished, a complaint was lodged by Nehru with the Security Council in January 1948. This resulted in a ceasefire on January 1, 1949. Indus River water dispute. Equitable sharing of the waters of the Indus system had been an issue of discord since partition. The partition gave India 5 million of the 28 million acres of land irrigated by the Indus. So, under the guidance of the World Bank, an interim agreement on canal waters was signed on April 17, 1959. Subsequently, a comprehensive agreement between the two countries was signed on September 19, 1960 in Karachi. B. India and China. Developments in Tibet and Panchshir to maintain peace. Nehru in 1954 concluded an agreement with China, which formalized the Chinese occupation of Tibet. The agreement is popularly known as Panchshir. Sino-India War, 1962. In October 1962, China attacked India in Nefa, Arunachal Pradesh, and Ladakh. Thus, a war between the two countries started, which ended in a military debacle for India. The Western powers, the USA as well as Britain, pledged support to India and were already flying arms to India. In November 1962, China made a unilateral declaration of its withdrawal. Consequences of Sino-Indian War. The war gave a big blow to the self-respect of India. The policy of non-alignment came under question. The Congress lost 3 parliamentary by-elections in a row and Nehru had to face the first no-confidence motion of his life. The third 5-year plan was badly affected as resources were diverted for defense. India's foreign policy took a change. As the US and the UK had responded positively in the crisis, they were to be considered in future. U.S. intelligence agencies developed links in the name of countering the Chinese threat and even planted a nuclear-powered device in the Himalayas. Pakistan, encouraged by the Indian debacle in the war, was to attack India in 1965, covertly helped by China. India and Nepal. The geographical location of Nepal has made it inseparable from India from the point of view of India's external security. Being conscious of this factor, India signed a treaty with Nepal in July 1950 by which it recognized Nepal's sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence. www.desireus.com Mail id. caredesireus@gmail.com Spectrum Short Notes 157. India and Bhutan. In August 1949, the two countries signed a treaty for perpetual peace and friendship. India undertook to exercise non-interference in the internal administration of Bhutan, while Bhutan agreed to be guided by the advice of Government of India in regard to its external relations. India and Sri Lanka. The Indian government, considering the ethnic disputes in Sri Lanka to be an internal matter of that country, remained friendly towards Sri Lanka.